Weirdos! Hi, thanks for joining me again. I hope that you enjoyed last week's episode of Weird, where we talked about Clifford Olson, the Beast of British Columbia. My name's Lindsay. I am your host. I have to say, I am super grateful and so excited at some of the feedback I've had from you guys about this podcast. Particularly thankful for Jossie, who left a wonderful review on iTunes. Thank you, Jossie, for that. It's pretty neat as a brand new podcaster to hear such nice things said about what you're putting out there. So gratitude and thank you to everybody. Our tale this week is of the Black Donnellys. If you are from Canada, there's a chance you may have heard about this. If you are from outside of Canada, I don't know. I mean, you might have heard about it, but it's just kind of one of those legendary things that I don't know if it's really crossed the border into other countries or not. But this is definitely a story that I was raised with and have heard and researched in my life. So I'm very excited to share it with you today. The tale of the Donnellys is lavish with murder and mayhem. Much of the legacy has become entangled in speculation and myth, and it really crosses the boundaries of fact and imagination. It has everything: imprisonment, a dramatic rescue, religious turmoil, lies, deceit, chases, escapes, true love. Okay, it's not exactly The Princess Bride, probably more Texas Chainsaw, really, but it does culminate in a bloody massacre, so you get the point. There's a lot going on here. But to understand the circumstances surrounding that fateful February night, we need to go back to Ireland in the early 1800s. James Donnelly was born March 7th, 1816. He was known as a hard worker, as well as for his heavy drinking and getting into fights, as you do. Ireland at the time was experiencing a lot of famine and food shortages. There was a very strange political atmosphere. Oliver Cromwell's conquest had recently taken place, so there was a lot of the tension between the Protestant population as well as the Roman Catholic population. There was an article written in the Nina Gazette, April 30th, 1842, about the crime rate in Tipperary, which is where the Donnellys came from. And that article reads, "Almost every hour brings intelligence from each section of this country of murder, assault, robbery of arms, and posting of threatening notices. The sensation produced by one series of atrocity has not subsided when we are stunned by enormities of a deeper and deadlier character. In fact, crimes in this neighborhood increase in fearfulness as they proceed and multiply till they become almost too numerous to record." So I think we can probably say things weren't great at the time. The Donnellys were really quite central to a lot of the disputes that were going on. They were known as Blackfeet, which were Roman Catholics, but in some form or another, they had also supported the Protestants. So this meant that they weren't well received on either side. They were kind of in the middle. James was working as a coach driver when he met his future wife, Johanna. Now, Johanna worked as a servant at a large estate, but her father definitely did not approve of this relationship. So his solution was to have Johanna locked away so she couldn't be with James Donnelly. Now, I can't speak for other teenage girls. I can really only speak for me. And, I didn't have anybody hotly pursuing me when I was a teenager, but if I did, and if I was told that I couldn't see him, and if I was locked away so that I couldn't see him, I think my, natural response would be to run away with him and have 8 kids with him in a different country, which is exactly what happened. James broke into the house, rescued Johanna, and they married in 1840. Prior to their departure to Canada, James Jr. was born, but then they soon left for Ontario in Canada. They settled in Lucan in the township of Biddulph, Ontario, which is about 25 kilometers north of London, modern-day London, Ontario. There's a very heavy Irish population there. They ended up squatting on some land that belonged to the Canada Company, which we're going to go into some details about that in a little bit. They couldn't afford to purchase their own land. They may or may not have known that they were squatting, but the practice of squatting was really common at the time, and it was actually often supported by the courts, not necessarily legally sanctioned, but they kind of look the other way because it was such a common practice. They cleared the land and they farmed it for at least a decade and had several other children. So this area known as Lucan in Biddulph, it was initially founded in 1829 as the Wilberforce Colony, named after William Wilberforce. He was a British abolitionist. It was an outgrowth of the American Colonization Society, it was 800 acres purchased by James C. Brown and Stephen Dutton in the Biddulph Township. And what it was used for is Brown would bring back African American citizens who were fleeing a lot of the persecution that they were experiencing in the States. So about 460 people left Cincinnati due to persecution there, and they were brought to this area known as the Wilberforce Colony. Conditions, of course, were incredibly difficult. Disease, exposure, but despite that, schools and churches were built and businesses were established. Overall, approximately 32 families did settle in that area, but by 1835 that had been reduced down to 12 families, and eventually only one family was really left in the area. And that is when the Canada Company came in. They acquired the land to sell to prospective settlers. Biddulph was in what's called the Huron Tract, which is very fertile land. It's ideal for farming, but many of the Irish settlers, such as the Donnellys, really couldn't afford to purchase the land, and so that's where you would see a lot of the squatting that we had mentioned before. Of course, cultural difficulties involving race, religion, ethnicity, and voting caused constant tension in the area. So it's not like that was left behind in Ireland or any of these other places. Like it was happening everywhere. The Donnellys would eventually be blamed for a lot of the chaos and the violence in the area, but it is really important to note and understand that this violence and this chaos, it existed in excess prior to the Donnellys even arriving in Lucan. So this has been an ongoing problem for a very long time. In fact, a lot of justice of the peace officers, they wouldn't go to that area at night. They would only go during the day. There was a letter written to John A. Macdonald, who at the time, he would eventually become Prime Minister of Canada, but at the time he was the Attorney General. And this was written March 28, 1859. And the letter states, "My dear attorney, pray excuse my troubling you in the enclosed criminal case, as we have no county attorney, and even if we had, I should feel anxious to have your advice. You may perhaps remember and there's a long report in there, concerning certain murders and burnings in Biddulph, in these counties, in which cases it was extremely difficult to obtain evidence owing to the disposition of the witnesses to screen the guilty parties. One case in particular, the murder of Brimacombe, of which Ryder was accused, has given us much trouble and led to much expense, and Ryder is still at large. The state of the neighborhood is very bad, owing to the fear each entertains of his neighbor and the fights which occasionally take place. The justice of the peaces are not safe. I, for one, always go there in daylight. The coroner is in real danger. Now we have got at the names of the witnesses, but if Ryder is arrested, they will all bolt for fear of his violence should he be acquitted. I have done my best in charges to the grand jury to persuade them against this old Irish system of shielding criminals, won't be an informer, and so forth." So this was signed R. Cooper. So yes, things were not great. And that level of corruption did go up through the law enforcement system as well. And we will hear more about that later. So as I said, the Canada Company, they took over this land, and they soon handed it over to another settler named James or John Grace. But then he handed that land over to a man named Patrick Farrell. Farrell arrived in Biddulph from Ireland only to find that part of his land was being occupied by the Donnellys, who by this point had been there for about a decade. There was, of course, a confrontation. Farrell was not happy. James Donnelly Sr. was not happy, and it came to fisticuffs, and Farrell lost. So he took the Donnellys to court. The judge ruled that the Donnellys could keep the part of the land that they cleared and farmed, and Farrell could have the rest, but neither party was content with this solution. So this resulted in a long-standing feud between them. Farrell started to claim that the Donnellys commenced a period of harassment against him, such as killing his livestock and setting his barn on fire, shooting at him, things like that. Whether or not the Donnellys actually did these things, we're not sure. It's almost like Making a Murderer, where, this family becomes the target of law enforcement in the community, but they may or may not have committed a lot of the things that they were accused of. So it's interesting. But things really come to a head in 1857, where James Donnelly is helping out with a logging bee. The community is coming together to build a log cabin, so they're all at this logging bee, having a good time, drinking. But then tensions arise between Patrick Farrell and James. Patrick allegedly attacked Donnelly first. I've read conflicting reports. Some say it was with an axe and some say it was with his fists. Either way, James Donnelly fought back with his fists, but then he managed to grab an iron handspike, which he drove through Patrick Farrell's head, effectively ending his life. Because of this, James Donnelly went into hiding for 2 years, and nobody could find him. But what's interesting about that, he was actually just hiding around the outskirts of his own homestead. And some sources say that a mystery woman was seen in women's clothing helping Johanna Donnelly on the homestead. A rumor was that it was James Sr., but before the authorities could arrive, this mystery person would disappear, kind of like the Pokeroo. But Donnelly did eventually turn himself in. He was initially sentenced to be hung, but his wife undertook a petition and managed to have his sentence commuted to 7 years. There's also, there was some sources too that said because it was ruled as being self-defense, that also helped to commute his sentence. So it could be one or the other or both. Either way, Johanna for the next 7 years, fucking badass, she raised all of these children on her own, and she worked the farm. She sold a portion of the land so a school could be put up, and she worked as the school's custodian and would cook food for them and all kinds of stuff so that she could support her family. Finally, 1865 rolls around and James Sr. returns home. One would hope that this would be kind of the end to their troubles, but really this was just the beginning. After this, the Donnellys were consistently being accused of criminal behavior, including arson and assaults. Many of these accusations were thrown out. Either, witnesses didn't want to talk, or maybe the accounts weren't true, or maybe the justice system was corrupt. I mean, who knows? It could be any number of things. Some believed that the Donnellys were an evil family who terrorized the area, whereas others believed that the Donnellys were really simply scapegoats for the crime that was already happening in that area. So eventually, William Donnelly, one of the Donnelly boys, he opened up his own stagecoach business in the early 1870s, and it was really becoming quite successful. So then a competing stagecoach line was opened shortly after by a man named Patrick Flanagan. A wheel, sadly, fell off of one of Flanagan's stagecoaches, and this destroyed the coach, and it killed the driver. Of course, naturally, the Donnellys were immediately accused of sabotage. So then a Flanagan driver, as retaliation, cut off a Donnelly carriage, which sent passengers flying every which way. The rivalry went back and forth, with carriages being destroyed and barns being burned and horses being slaughtered, each group blaming the other. So then, a man named Father John Connolly arrives on the scene. He's a Roman Catholic priest in 1879, and he forms what was called the Peace Society. And this was intent to rid the community of the Donnellys. Part of this Peace Society is a man named James Carroll, who had charged the Donnellys with assault. He eventually became a constable, and he vowed to rid the township of the pestilence known as the Donnellys. So now we are in January of 1880, and a man named Patrick Ryder has his barns burnt down. Thomas, William, and John, three of the Donnelly boys, happened to be at a wedding that night, so they had a solid alibi. So the eyes turn to Joanna and James Sr., who are now being blamed for arson. And this was really the last straw for the township. A group of armed men met together February 4th, 1880, and they went to the Donnelly homestead. There was an eyewitness who saw everything that happened that night. Young Johnny O'Connor, he was a boy who had been hired to look after the homestead while the Donnellys were away for their arson trial that they were accused of from Patrick Ryder's barn burning down. So Johnny O'Connor is sleeping in the house, as was Thomas Donnelly, and they were both kind of near the front. Constable James Carroll, who was by this time considered the leader of the Peace Society, he was the first inside, and he handcuffed Thomas Donnelly to the bed while he was sleeping, which, of course would wake him up. James Sr. and Joanna come out to stoke the fire, and they see that Thomas was handcuffed and obviously wanted to know what was going on, at which point Tom addressed James Carroll and asked to see a warrant. And it was then that the mob stormed into the house, approximately 20 people, according to Johnny O'Connor, and beat James Sr., breaking his skull. Johanna fought back valiantly and was also beaten to death. Now, by all accounts, Tom nearly escaped, but was stabbed repeatedly with a pitchfork as he ran outside. He was then brought back into the house. The mob continued to beat Tom in his head with a shovel. Now, Bridget Donnelly was James Sr.'s niece, who was either visiting from Ireland or who had moved there from Ireland. I read conflicting accounts. She runs upstairs. And, I gotta feel bad for her because she's thinking, I'm gonna hit up Canada, I'm gonna eat some poutine, I'm gonna watch a hockey game, I'm gonna have a double-double from Tim Hortons. She is not expecting to get murdered during a massacre by an angry mob that she probably knows absolutely nothing about. But anyway, she runs upstairs, the mob chases after her, and she too is killed. She's brought back downstairs and laid on top of James Sr. Now, this is just add insult to injury, really. The Donnellys had a tiny little dog who was maybe barking or making some noise, I don't know. But instead of just leaving because they've already killed 4 people, they decide to smash the dog on the head and then decapitate it, which, that's really overkill at this point. The whole thing is overkill, but that's just unnecessary. They take a bunch of coal oil, they dump it and all over the bodies, and they set the house on fire. Poor Johnny O'Connor has witnessed all of this carnage. He manages to escape the inferno. He had actually had difficulty getting out of the house because Joanna's body had been blocking the door, which is just, it's terrifying and traumatizing. I can't imagine what he must have gone through. It didn't end there. The violence continued as the mob went over to William Donnelly's home, which was close by. Unfortunately for John Donnelly, who was closer to the door, heard commotion outside. And you know how actually they got his attention? They started to beat William Donnelly's horses so that the horses would cry out and it would rouse the people inside. And when that didn't work, they started screaming fire. And so John Donnelly wakes up, he's hearing fire, goes outside to see what the hell's going on, and is met with essentially a firing squad. So they're shooting him, and he's filled with lead holes and falls back into the house and dies. They left, or the mob leaves, thinking that they've killed William, not realizing that William is still alive. And that's the massacre. They just kind of went on this killing rampage of murdering this family. A bunch of the other Donnelly children had moved away, such as Jenny and a few others. So not the entire family wasn't slaughtered, but you know, they definitely got a few of them, which is just tragic. But many of the participants were charged with these murders: Thomas Ryder, James Carroll, John Purtell, Martin McLaughlin, John Kennedy, and James Ryder. However, no one was convicted for the massacre of the Donnellys. Johnny O'Connor testified in court that he clearly remembers someone saying, "Hit that fellow on the head and break his skull open," and that it was a member of the Peace Society who followed through with the act. But the testimony was not taken seriously due to his age. And there was evidence and testimony against James Carroll specifically, but he still managed to go free. Some reports do say that since then, many of the vigilante members met gruesome deaths after the Donnelly massacre, and that's known as the Revenge of the Donnellys. It's sort of a local legend, if you will. Some believe it to be a curse, others believe it to be the revenge from the remaining family members, but difficult to say at this point, I guess, depending on how much of your disbelief you are willing to suspend. The Donnelly homestead is currently owned by Robert and Lisa Saltz. They moved there in 1988. And of course, and I'm pretty sure you can see what's coming, since moving in, they have reported having feelings of being watched, the sensation of being touched with no one being there. Robert Saltz reported hearing a masculine voice call out his name in the night, round about the same hour that the massacre took place. Charles Saltz, Robert and Lisa's son, reported seeing ghostly figures in his room: 2 adults, a man and a woman dressed in black, and 2 children dressed in white. And there's also reports of strange footsteps when no one else is home and things like that. So today, there's museums and breweries and plays and documentaries that have been created to honor or commemorate the Donnelly legend. There's actually a brewery, this is kind of my favorite modern tidbit here. There's a brewery in Ontario called the Black Donnelly Brewing Company that brews craft beer. So if you're into beer, you can hit them up at black-donnellys.com and see what they've got to offer there. The Lucan Area Heritage and Donnelly Museum, located in Lucan, Ontario, has a lot of in-depth information about the area, including the Wilberforce colony and, of course, the Donnelly family, complete with a Donnelly escape room. And thus ends the tragic and gruesome tale of the Black Donnellys. Thank you again so much for listening. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Stitcher. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. I don't mind. I'll be back next week with more strangeness, and until then, stay